Now, one of the things I'm very happy to say that we've developed on this show is a series of people who we talk to on a regular basis about just life in general. I think people really enjoy it. I think it gives us an opportunity to stretch our legs, if you like. There's none of this kind of, he said, she said. There's no arguments. There's no shouting. There's no denying people the right to speak. And in fact, what we're doing is giving you, the listener, an opportunity to hear what people have to say in a method which I think is a much better one than some other places do. So let's welcome Neil Oliver once again to the show. Neil, a very good morning to you.
Hi, Mike. Thanks for having me back.
No, not at all. Not at all. Listen, a great piece again this week in the Sunday Times where you talked about money making the world go round. But the thing that we may be missing here in all of the kind of mask wearing and the not going out is the kind of the human interaction and the touch and not just the love of one another, but the whole kind of experience of being with other people.
Very much so. I'm not calling out to the government to change what it's doing. And as you said, I mean, it's obviously a nightmarishly complicated and constantly changing picture that all of these poor souls are having to try and deal with on an hour by hour, minute by minute basis. But I just feel it's incumbent upon us all to be mindful of the fact that there will be consequences for the actions that are being taken. And I definitely feel that the necessity to maintain the distance between one another and to wear masks will have consequences on the way that we deal with one another. And it's difficult enough. We know that tempers get frayed so easily. And the more complications that are added into that, the cocktail that is, human interaction, it just makes it harder for people. And I think we'll have to just be mindful of the fact that wearing masks, holding each other at arm's length, necessary though it is or may be, we'll have to get beyond it at some point. Or if this situation continues indefinitely, we will need to treat each other better, because it seems that at the moment tempers are just getting more and more frayed, and people aren't being as tolerant of one another as we need to be.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether you've been able to see what's been going on in Portland, Oregon, where there's kind of rioting on a mass scale going on, still by and large caused by the whole Black Lives Matter argument. But there's militias in America now where you see terribly frightening images of two different groups of people literally armed to the teeth, turning up wearing masks, carrying machine guns, burning buildings down. It looks like a scene from Zombie Apocalypse to me.
Yes, I think what most people of all colours and creeds, I think what most people feel when they look on at that is just a smouldering anxiety, first and foremost, about what the future might hold. And I think it's a demonstration of what we have seen from history down through the centuries and the millennia, that there's an urge often for revolution and destruction. And Roger Scruton famously said words to the effect that destruction is exhilarating and thrilling, and the work of creation or building is slow and laborious and boring. And there is that thrill. And I think you mentioned Portland, which is, I suppose, the most infamous example at the moment, where on the one hand, where people are justifiably saying that things need to improve and things need to change, coming straight in on the coattails of that seems to be this desire to destroy. And and the pictures of the aftermath of protests are so disheartening, because places are just being ruined. And strewn with litter and mess and graffiti and broken windows, and there's no account taken of whether the people whose businesses and properties they're destroying are in favour of calls for change or standing opposed to it. It's just a wholesale destruction that seems to be meted out across the board, and it is so easy to destroy. And we have to, at some point, surely in the evolution of our species, we have to try and get to a point where our first reaction is not vengeance for the past and not to seek to settle scores, because that is just what perpetuates the idea of blood feud. you know, you hurt me, and so now I've got the upper hand briefly or for the longer term, and now I will hurt you. And that just perpetuates the cycle of violence and destruction. And if only there could be a time where there was a call for change and rapprochement and conversation that wasn't presaged and punctuated with a hellish moment of just violent destruction, which pleases no one. And whatever short-term, you know, bloodlust might inspire it never, ever helps.
No.
And we know this.
And there's a certain irony as well
to it. And violence in the past, and it never helps.
No. And there's a certain irony as well to it. A friend of mine who lives in Santa Monica put out a picture on social media of a particular block on Santa Monica Boulevard in West Hollywood, where all of the businesses have basically been boarded up because the riots destroyed them. One was an Indian restaurant. One was a shop that was run by some Chinese people. Another place was run by some people from Eastern Europe. You know, it was basically a very multicultural sort of street block. And there was graffiti all over the boarded up signs that said peace and love. But basically, these businesses have been destroyed by people who say that they want to protect those particular minorities.
Yeah, the appetite, the seemingly endless, insatiable appetite for destruction is so discouraging. I wrote it. You mentioned that I had written at the weekend, and this is on a much smaller scale, you know, but as a consequence of lockdown, where I live in Stirling in Scotland, you know, you couldn't help but notice that because everything was on pause, that everything started to get overgrown.
Yes.
You know, the verges and the flower beds that are normally, you know, lovingly tended by the council gardeners and all the rest of it, and you know, the grass and weeds were coming up through the pavements because people weren't walking on them, and even the tarmac of the roads, you know, the grass was starting to come up in the you know, where the white line would be because cars weren't passing over it. And you see how quickly, just a reminder that it only takes a few weeks really for disorder and an element of chaos to come in. And it's so, I think it's so important. It would be so helpful if people were more minded to care, you know, to care about maintaining places. I mean, it's not just, you don't have to go the length of deciding not to smash the windows of a shop or not to daub graffiti all over something. It's so much smaller than that. If everyone likes to say that they care about the world around them, and that they care to hand on something in a better condition to the generation coming after them. And that in reality, that has to manifest itself in the smallest acts, first of all. You know, it's, you know, charity begins at home, as they say. And I always think that you want, before someone says that they're going to change the world, before someone says that they would run the country or the world differently, I'm always interested to see, or I'm always curious to know how they run their life. Mm. You know, if I want to know that their spare room is tidy and orderly, and that they're in the habit of making their bed and washing the dishes and putting them away and taking care and cutting the grass in their garden if they have one, or clipping the hedges and looking after things. Because if they don't, I would be suspicious of that person. If they can't look after their own small thing, realistically, should they be running the Home Office or defence or changing the world if they can't maintain? And I'm always, when people say in the case of protests, for example, that are going on in the United States and here at home, when people say we need change and we could make a better world, when the first act is just a chaotic destruction, I think, well, are you serious?
Yeah.
Are you serious that you are actually someone who should be entrusted with making and building a better world? If your first act on getting any kind of power is to destroy what's there just wantonly. So I see that as a fundamental disconnect. And at that point, I just become a bit deaf to anything else that they might want to say.
Yes.
Because I think, well, the first thing you did when you got the chance was to smash a window or cut down a tree. I don't see it.
Well, whenever I see people marching around with placards, I always think of that great scene from Father Ted, where the guys are standing outside a theatre or a cinema, I think it is, with a sign that just says, "Down with this sort of thing." and they're not entirely sure what this sort of thing is. They just want to make sure that it doesn't happen and it's not made available to anybody. And it's a kind of a recalcitrant sort of demonstration about nothing at all.
Yeah, I think people, if your life has given you by your own efforts or in any other way things that you love, however small, to use the analogy of a garden, I suppose, to create a garden, even a small garden, beside your house, it is an enormous amount of work, and it's slow and laborious. It's not very glamorous, and it's constant. It's an incessant labour of love in order to create something that briefly flowers for a few weeks or months every year and gives you that pleasure. And once you've done that, for people who are gardeners and they create, then you instantly have something that you want to protect. And so it brings out that sort of conservative instinct,
yes,
because you now have something in which you have invested time and labour and love, and you want it to survive.
Yeah.
And that's so that's where that sort of conservative, protective instinct comes from that so many people have. But then if you have nothing, and if you never either have the opportunity to invest in something, or even given the opportunity, if you never do invest in the laborious work of building, then you never will get to the point where you care enough about anything to protect it and hope that it will be in a condition that can be passed on into the future.
Yeah.
And
also you'll probably have a different attitude as well towards the history perhaps of your country, or the history of your family, and the history of where we are and how we got to where we are. Because I was looking at your podcast. You do a podcast, Love Letter to the British Isles, and this week I was thinking, it's what you've just said is applies to education as well, because it's much harder to learn things than it is to just ignore them. You have to invest some time, you have to look at things, you have to read things, you have to visit places. And you went to Grimes Graves this week, which is a fascinating place. Tell us a little bit about that.
Oh gosh, Grimes Graves is the name given to it. It's quite a large archaeological site actually in Norfolk. And when you arrive, it's a bizarre spectacle because it's like a lunar landscape. It's grass-covered craters,
right,
dotted. It's like looking at the moon, only the moon where grass has grown over the craters. It's called Grimes Graves is an Anglo-Saxon name that was given to it, and it means the quarries of the masked man, or the quarries of the hooded man. It's a reference to a god. In reality, though, it's the remains of shafts that were dropped down into the chalk by Neolithic farmers 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, because they were in pursuit of flint, a layer of flint that they knew to be there. And to get at it, they were prepared to drop shafts, 30 feet deep, 20 feet wide, to get down to the level where they could get access to the flint. And then they excavated chambers and tunnels and cavities from which they brought out the flint. And it was done on a semi-industrial scale. We don't necessarily think of the first farmers organising themselves so comprehensively that they could conduct such a feat, but they did. And they were bringing out massive amounts of flint, and they weren't just using it themselves. It was going out into the wider British Isles. They were a source for the supply of flint that many people were able to use. And when you go there now, the archaeologists have emptied out one or two of them, and there's now limited, admittedly, but there's access to some of these chambers, and it's absolutely extraordinary, hair-raising, magical almost, because you go down into this still airless environment, and there are still the picks that were a reindeer antler that the miners were using as part of the when they were digging out the chalk to get at the flint. And 5,000 years ago, when they finished, they just laid the picks against the wall of the mine and went away and backfilled them and did something else. And it's the thought that those tools have just lain there, slumped against the wall, exactly where they were put, while all the history that we care about has happened. The rise and fall, empires, kingdoms, wars. Those antlers were just there, waiting in the dark to be rediscovered. And you go down into that chamber at Grimes Graves, and you can persuade yourself that you've walked into the Neolithic world. Now, I have had countless experiences like that because I'm interested in archaeology, and I've had the great privilege of pursuing a lot of these stories all over the British Isles, England, Ireland, Scotland and Wales. And fundamentally, what I wrote, what I speak about in that podcast and what I've written about and continue to write about is that I almost, without making any choice, I fell in love with the landscape of the British Isles, the whole place, the whole island, because I've seen so much of it, and I've been treated to so many stories of the long evolution of our species, all the adventures, all the disasters, all the endeavour, the aspiration and the ambition, and it's made manifest in things that are still there, the Stonehenges, the Aveburys, places like Grimes Graves, other places where you see evidence of people thousands of years ago overcoming their circumstances and doing something grand endeavour. And it's that I'm in love with the landscape of the British Isles and the stories of the British Isles and the history and the archaeology of the British Isles, and I'm suffused with it. And so, and on account of that, when I look out at the present and I see what's happening, I'm responding. I feel I'm responding to the place as though it's going through a time of pain, and I want it to get through the time of pain, because times of pain have come before, but the history shows us that we have overcome and moved on and aspired and had inspiration and done great things in the aftermath of disaster.
Yeah. And
I take great comfort from knowing that we have overcome one challenge after another for thousands of years. And eventually we get up into the high ground, if you like, and we can look out over the landscape and remember who we are and where we've come from and do the next great thing. But the next great thing will be an act of creation and not destruction. It will come from an inspiration, great or small, and we will hopefully, I hope with all my heart, that we'll move on to doing something great.
Well, I hope so. And maybe that's the problem at the moment, that all we have is a lot of people looking out and seeing the gutter as opposed to the stars, and seeing, bad things, and seeing negativity, and seeing, the COVID virus and Brexit and all the things that they think of in a negative manner. I mean, I'm looking today at a tweet from the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan's office, which says this: "For too long, our public spaces have failed to reflect our city's great diversity, and it's time for this to change. Today, we've announced our new Partners Board, who will provide the expertise needed to improve diversity in London's public realm." Now, basically, they're saying that London, by and large, was kind of sort of demographied and created by Victorian Britain. Most of the names of the roads are Victorian, most of the statues are Victorian, most of what we see around London is Victorian, which I don't agree with, by the way. But they're going to set up a sort of a panel of people to see whether we should be renaming things, whether we should be removing things, and kind of really editing our history in a way.
And we've discussed aspects of this story, this conversation before, and I've said before, and I'll say again, that personally, I am not in the business of erasing history. I think you add to stories, and you accept and seek to understand what is there that's been gifted to us from the past. And in this context, you're talking about the built environment of a city like London. But the story of London is there in the street names, Threadneedle Street, some of these evocative place names, and from those words, those place names, you can, if you have a mind to, you can investigate the stories that grow out of them, and London is a massive book of stories, with a first page long ago and the more recent pages now. And it tells the story of London is without it might have an equal somewhere else on the planet, but I wouldn't necessarily say that there's a greater story to be told. No. There are other great stories, but the story of London is extraordinary from Roman antecedents and before. I mean, there are people in London before the Romans, of course there were, but you've got thousands of years of a story, and it's all there in the landscape. And yet there's a huge impact that was made on the built environment of London during the Victorian era. Of course there was, because it was a time of great inspiration and aspiration. Sometimes you look at what the Victorians and people like Isambard Kingdom Brunel and whatever were capable of, and you think, God, I wonder why they stopped short of going to the moon.
Yeah.
Their ambition was without limit. And what they built and what they created was extraordinary. It simply was an extraordinary part of the story, but it's only a part of the story.
Yeah.
You know, the Roman London is there. The Great Fire of London, if you dig a hole in parts of London down through the street, you'll come to a thick layer of black, which is the Great Fire of London. It's still there.
Yeah.
You know, the burnt layer is still there. It's all there. Like a great book of pages with, and in the same way that a book, you can trap, you know, flowers from a loved one in between the pages and keep them as mementos. Yeah. It's all there.
Well, they discovered, I think it was only 2 or 3 years ago, I think, they discovered an entire Roman series of ruins underneath a building that they were putting up in Cannon Street, which I think turned out to be the new headquarters for Bloomberg. And they discovered this entire sort of, you know, pretty intact Roman villa, which they didn't even know was there.
Yes, and for me, because I mean, it's inescapable for me. Of course, it is, because I am drawn to a subject like archaeology, and I'm fascinated by the story that history gives us, or the stories in plural that history gives us. And I would never want to be without any of them. That's just not the way I would approach it. And so I don't see that you don't rename things. You make new things. And you come up with additional and new stories that tell the story of the generations that are here now. And in 1,000 years, the contribution by the present generations will be there along with everything else. But it's a terrible act of hubris and vanity to decide that you can look back a couple of hundred years, consider a whole set of years and accomplishments as mistakes or wrong, and rather than perhaps learning from that and moving on, to contemplate its destruction and to take it away as though it was never there, I fail to understand how that helps anyone.
Yeah, very dangerous
you know,
times.
Every story, every book. You know, you don't have a book that's just happy. You don't watch a movie and it's all just happy. There's jeopardy, and there's, you know, there are shades of light and dark, but they're part of what makes the story educational. You know, you learn from every part of the past. And so you keep it as far as possible. You keep it and you learn from it and you build on it. But it's all foundational levels. You don't suddenly create a new level floating in midair. Inevitably, it has to be built on the last thing that was done. But you don't throw it away.
No, absolutely not. Neil, great to talk to you again. Thank you very much indeed. The podcast is called Love Letters to the British Isles, and we'll talk to you same time next week. Neil Oliver, thank you very much indeed. Lots more for us to do here at Talk Radio. Very thought-provoking stuff, that. You can't just do away with history. Sadiq Khan wants to rename parts of London. I, for one, will be standing 4 square against it, because that's not what you do. This is Talk Radio.